welcome to our panel. This is in commemoration of the Second Vatican Council, which began meeting actually in 1962, and it ran for 3 years through 1965. So this is the first of two panels on that event. We're going to give you an overview of what happened at Vatican II. Professor LoPinto has passed out some of the titles of some of the documents, and we're going to be touching on some of those today as part of the overview. Then a second event is planned for next month. We're going to talk about the impact of the Second Vatican Council on Catholic social thought. And it'll be in the same room, and I'll announce the date sometime. You'll find it on the web. We're a very diverse group today, of course. It's so good to see so many different faces, the age groups, clergy, faculty. It's so good to see such a great turnout. But there's some who remember Vatican II quite well because we lived through it. But polls indicate that the majority of Catholics today do not know what happened at Vatican II. In fact, they don't even know that it happened in some cases. So if they do know about it, a lot of times it's interpreted badly. So I think we're going to try to correct some of that. It kind of reminds me of a story of a religious professor who asked one of his students lately, can you tell me what Vatican II is? And the student said, yes, that's the Pope's second home, right? No. Or he asked another student, and she answered, oh, well, that's when they elect the Pope, right? No. Obviously, she had current events, on her mind. But that's wrong, too. So the other thing, just as a follow-up, so please, we're going to try to keep our focus on the Second Vatican Council. I know there's a lot of things in the news, about Benedict the 16th. There's a lot of speculations and so forth. So we'll let the New York Times and the Italian media take care of that right now. Okay, we're going to focus on Vatican II. If you want to ask as a follow-up question at the end, what was his position on Vatican II? I think that would have opened a very interesting way toward a conversation. So once again, I want to welcome you and the panel. I want to do a couple introductions here then. We have seated here Msgr LoPinto. Some of you are familiar with him because he's spoken here before. He's the Vicar for Human Services for the Diocese of Brooklyn. He's the pastor of St. Helens Parish in Howard Beach, and he's Executive Vice President for Catholic Charities of Brooklyn and Queens. And I'm so pleased to see so many people that have turned out from that agency here today to support Monsignor. Seated by Monsignor is Tom Cornell. He's an adjunct professor of Catholic social thought at St. Joseph's Seminary in Dunwoody, New York. That's the diocese's major seminary. And he's a 60-year veteran of the Catholic worker movement. And we do have some people associated with the movement here today, too. So I'm glad we have that as part of our group. I just want to give you a little background for a couple minutes about Vatican II. It was the 21st General Council of the Roman Catholic Church. So automatically we know there were 20 councils that preceded Vatican II. I think most of us are familiar with the Council of Nicaea, which met in 325, because most of us who are practicing Catholics recite a profession of faith at the liturgy, which brings into the Nicene Creed. God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made, consubstantial with the Father. So what that council did was it did establish the divinity of Christ in relationship to God the Father. So that was the first council. Now we're with Vatican II. And we did have a Vatican I then, obviously, if we have a Vatican II. That met in 19th century, 1868 to 1870. And probably the most historic result of that is the notion of papal infallibility. That came out of Vatican I. But that was 143 years ago, so it's been a long time since we've had a council of the Church. There were 2 years in preparation for this council as well. The council issued 16 documents, 4 constitutions that probably changed the church forever. Now, just to go back to the differences within this assembly here, we have people that live through the council. There are people, again, that, you know, of course, never heard of it. So I just want to do a little quick survey here. I've got 3 sets of questions, and each relates to the council. So one set of questions is the pre-Vatican era, the second is the council era, and the third is the post-council era. And I'd like only Catholic lay people to answer these questions, okay? People that are familiar with the Second Vatican Council and lived through that period, that were practicing Catholics at the time. So let's begin with a question. In other words, what was it like to be a Catholic in the 40s and 50s? Basically, that's what I'm trying to get at, okay? So here's the question. What features or elements of being a Catholic would you say were most distinctive in themselves and important to you in the period before the Council? Would anybody care to answer that? In other words, what was going on, you know, that, you know, you could really get into, you could relate to? And we're maybe disappointed that the Council kind of did away with these things. Well, let's give you a little push. The Latin Mass, right? So that's what I'm looking for. Anything else that was going on before Vatican II that seemed distinctive and important to you? Yes?
Well, you couldn't eat meat on Fridays. That was...
Very good. So practices, Catholic practices. Anything else? Yes?
Nuns and habits.
All right, nuns and habits, priests with collars. Most were black, dressed in black. Okay, good. Anything else? Just a couple more. Yes?
There's no ecumenical trust.
Right, kind of inward-looking church, right, not reaching out. Had a very dim view of Protestants, actually, in some ways, right? Okay. So, oh, here's one I was wondering if people could relate to. Why did your 4th grade teacher sometimes pin a Kleenex tissue on your head before she would allow you to attend Mass? I'm talking to women here now. Who knows the answer to that? Yes. No, I'd like a woman to answer this first. Yeah. That's right. Yes, you covered your head before you went into the service. Okay. How many of you wrote JMJ as the header of your assignments, on your assignments in grade school? And what does JMJ stand for? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Okay. Okay, council questions. It's been called the most important religious event in the history of the church for the past 400 years. So, how many of us here have actually read some of the council documents? Very good. Okay, we got 1 out of 70. Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. Good. All right. I guess as a follow-up, how did you feel about what was happening in Rome at that time between 1962 and 65? How did you feel about what was going on? If you knew what was going on, how did you feel about what was going on? Go ahead.
Incredibly excited and hopeful for the future of the church.
Hopeful for the church. So you thought there'd be some changes going on then?
More than changes, the whole transformation.
Transformation, okay. And of course some of that did happen. All right, and then after the council. So I think we've established in some ways that growing up Catholic before the council was a lot different than it is today. What do you see as the biggest difference between how we practice our faith today, you know, how the church is today, than the way it was before the council? How do you see the biggest difference? Yes?
Probably the liturgy itself.
So can you give me an example?
Well, it's done in the vernacular, your native tongue.
Right, okay.
The priest now faces the people.
That's right. Before, and many of you didn't know, if you're not familiar, the priest's back was to the congregation. It was almost an inward, it was the priest, and then we were just kind of observers. Of course, you had the altar rail, of course, which was symbolic, you know, of the separation. Okay, so I think this survey illustrates again that there was kind of like a Catholic culture that was almost in every corner, as I saw it in Catholic. I was a practicing Catholic, brought up Catholic, went to Catholic grade school. I could mention again things like, oh, this was always a killer for me. You'd have to fast before you received communion, and it had to be the night before. And if you were out with Protestant friends, you know, and you were there after midnight at the hamburger place, it was torture. It was, especially if you were going to a late mass, fasting before receiving the Eucharist. There were no lay readers, of course, in the liturgy either. I think another thing that was very important to many people at this time were the teaching nuns that staffed the schools, the overcrowded schools, the parish priests in their lives. Seminaries and convents were overflowing at this time. They weren't big enough to hold everybody that wanted to, that had a vocation. The other thing you could say is that the church before Vatican II was very robust. It was growing. We were very proud of the fact that Fulton J. Sheen had the most popular TV show on a Sunday night. That was in the late 50s. A bishop had the most popular TV show on television. We're also very proud that a guy named, who was a Hollywood star, Bing Crosby, was a Catholic, and he played Catholic priests. Yeah, I can remember the Bells of St. Mary's that he starred in. In New York, who did we have as our Archbishop? Francis Cardinal Spellman. Very powerful. In fact, his residence behind St. Patrick's Cathedral was called the Powerhouse because he had the power to make and break mayors, police commissioners, probably even presidents. There were all kinds of organizations that began with Catholic Poetry Society, Catholic Sociology Society, Legion of Decency. That was another one that was very important. And pre-Vatican II Catholics had attitude. Again, they had attitude toward Protestants. They were kind of like second class. They had attitude about their philosophy. The governing philosophy was scholastic philosophy, which had universal principles, and that would protect Catholics against the acids of what was called modernity. So those were things that were quite important, again, in the church. So it was a very triumphalistic age. It was very separatist, though. It was very insular. And, of course, the Vatican Council came along and dismantled a lot of that. Now, some people say that was wrong. In fact, there's been conferences that, with titles like, Did Vatican II Wreck the Church? Other titles are Searching for Vatican II, as if, you know, something is still missing. And Vatican II, Myth and Reality. Well, today's panel, we're pretty safe. We're just playing it, you know, after Vatican II, after 50 years, how did Vatican II change the church? So I'm going to turn it over now to our experts here.
That's the book. The original translation of the 16 documents that were produced by the council. You have in the handout, you have the listing of the documents along with the dates on which they were issued. A little bit of background on the council. It was announced by John the 23rd shortly after his installation as the Pope. We talk today about unprecedented events occurring in the life of the Church. This was perhaps the most unprecedented event. He went to St. Paul outside the wall on the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, January 25th, 1959, and surprised the world, including all of those who were there present with him, by announcing that he had plans to convene an ecumenical council, that he would bring to Rome all of the bishops of the world at that time, along with many outside observers. He was opening this event up not merely to the Catholic community, but he was opening this event up to our brothers and sisters in the ecumenical arena. Most especially, he was opening it up to the Protestant community. But even in his calling of the council, there was a great uniqueness, because he called it an ecumenical council in the sense that he was bringing together the leadership of all of the various rites of the Catholic Church. So it was not to be an exclusive event of the Roman Catholic Church, but he was bringing in the people from the East and from all of the different, as I say, the different rites. And one of the unique things that he did in designing the council was that the session of the council, each session of the council opened each morning with the celebration of liturgy. But it was not merely the celebration of the Latin liturgy. It was the celebration of the liturgy from all of the rites that made up the universal Catholic Church. So again, it was an attempt to expose those present in the aula, in the hall, which was the Basilica of St. Peter's, to expose them to the universal church. One of the great theologians of the council, a man by the name of Karl Rahner, described it as the breaking forth of the world church. For it was truly the first time that all of these different groups had been brought together. John also had a unique background, and that unique background was that he was not of the Roman crowd. John was a peasant. He grew up in a village up in the Bologna area, up in, actually I think it was more up in the northern Italy, in the Milan area, outside in a little village. He was a poor person, grew up in poverty, served as a military chaplain in World War I, taught history for a good while, and then was sent off in the diplomatic corps, was sent off to Bulgaria, to Turkey, and to France, before he was brought back to be the Patriarch of Venice, which was the position from which he then came to be elected as the successor to Pius XII. That's very important because, in a sense, he came to Rome with a very different perspective from those who were what we might call in the house. He brought the outside to Rome. And he brought his experiences of the outside because he was very directly related with the Church of the East. He worked very much during World War II with the Jewish refugees. He provided many of them with the documents that allowed them to flee Europe and escape persecution. And in France, he worked with the worker priests. And he worked with those who were developing the new theology, a theology that was looked very unfavorably by Rome, because Rome actually was in the process of silencing most of the theologians who were working in this arena. They were theologians who, in a sense, were making use of the new sources, the Scripture. Much work had been done to rediscover the Scriptures. There was the great translation of the Jerusalem Bible, which was translated from the original sources. So rather than depending upon translations of the Latin Bible, which had to be translated from the original, they went back and were able to work on the original, the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. And as a result of that, many new insights came. Many new insights came as to the understanding of the gospel message. They also discovered and worked very hard with the writings of the fathers, those who were the original theologians of the church. John's reason, in a sense of wanting to position that and put that up front, was that he recognized the church had come through a very broken history. And the way that you would resolve the broken history, or at least begin to lay out a path to, in a sense, overcome that broken history, was to go back to the common sources that everybody agreed to before the breakups. And that would be basically the Scripture and the writings of the fathers. So that much was done with that. The council broke a lot of new ground. That new ground, as somebody mentioned here early, that new ground was most visible to the people in the pew through the renewal of the liturgy. All of a sudden, you now had the vernacular, the native language, but you also more than had just the language, the native language. You had an openness to the cultures of the various people that would make up the fullness of the church. John had a beautiful phrase. He said the key was that you had to understand how much unity you needed and how much diversity you could live with. And in a sense, that became a model. The other piece that came out of the council, and you'll see in the documents, was, in a sense, really a revolution of the structure of the church, in the sense that there was a balancing, or an attempt to balance the centralized power of Rome, the Pope and the Curia, with the power of the bishops. You had now, as a result of the documents, you had literally a canonical basis for national conferences of bishops. And those bishops were given, in those conferences, they were given authority that they never had before by way of adapting the reality of the church to their local communities. They would have to send whatever they developed, would have to be signed off by Rome. But it would be out of their initiative. Here in our own country, one of the things that you would see from that, and I think Tom worked on one of these, was the challenge of peace, and the other was the document on the economy. Much happened, but how would I describe today the impact of the church on the church from the Vatican Council? I would describe it in two words: conflicts and tension. Tension in the sense, as Arnold spoke about how the council was received, and many who still find it very, very difficult to live with the changes that occurred, because it was a revolution. It did not abandon the past, but it took the past and tried to, in a sense, direct it into the future. It took the church from being a static institution to embracing dynamism. And a dynamism that would mean we could never stand still again. We had to continue to project ourselves forward in dialogue with the world. As Arnold mentioned, we were, prior to the council, very inwardly focused. The aim of the council was to direct the church outward, to engage the world around the values, the teachings of the gospel. And so it was a dynamic time. It was an exciting time. And hopefully, as with most councils, it takes about 100 years for them actually to put their roots in. We're only at 50. We'll live through the conflicts and the tensions of the moment. But I think if any of us have the good fortune of being around 100 years from now, you're going to see a very different face of the church, because you're finally going to see the embracing of the values and the teachings of the council, and that translation into the actual structure and organization of the council. I would dare say 100 years from now, you won't be worried about a conclave of cardinals gathering in Rome to elect a new pope, but you'll probably be witnessing something like the heads of the different conferences of bishops from around the world gathering in Rome with lay people and religious to try to come up with who they will select as their leader. And that would be in keeping with the spirit of Vatican II.
I'm optimistic by nature. So I'm looking forward to the future and all this conflict and tension. I see it as dynamic, leading to something bigger and better and more authentically Christian. I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. I write stories, I tell stories. I'm a teacher, but most of the time I'm telling stories about things I've been engaged in, things that happened, and I'm also a product of that marvelous old Catholic ghetto. The Irish, Italian, Eastern European ghetto. We were working class people then, and we had a memory, a working memory of the immigration, the great immigration, and it was really quite different because we had more of a working class attitude. We were close to the Jews. Talk about Cardinal Spellman. Bernie Brochel liked to say, New York was run by Cardinal Spellman and the Jews. Because we had such a good relationship. We came over on the same boats from Europe. We worked in the same factories. We learned English at the ILGWU. My aunt spoke English with an Italian Jewish accent. That's how she learned in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. I see you're laughing. You remember, that's the way it was. It was a lovely ghetto in many ways, but it couldn't last. We have climbed the socioeconomic ladder. Many of you have parents who went to college. In my prep school, yes, it was a prep school, a Jesuit prep school, tuition $150 a year, not a week. Yeah, poor people could afford it. I think we had 2 people out of 60 who had parents who had gone to college. I suspect that many of you have parents who went to college. My father didn't, my mother didn't. My mother had 1 year of high school. And, well, it was inward looking, yes. The Hudson Valley where I live, oh, the Angelus bell rung from the bottom all the way up to the top. There were monasteries and convents and friaries and brothers, the Christian brothers and the Irish Christian brothers, the French Christian brothers. The Angelus bells rang up and down the valley to send shivers up and down the spines of the old wasps. The fortress-like buildings, the Redemptorist friary. Huge, huge. Looks like a fortress. It was just bought by the Bruder home for $23 million cash on the barrelhead, and they put another $6 million into renovation. No loans. The Redemptorists had something like 4 guys rattling around in that great place. And of course, the great Jesuit novitiate, St. Andrews on the Hudson, is now, as Dorothy Day called it, a cooking school, the Culinary Institute of America. Great place. But some people will look at this and say, decline. Well, how long could that old ghetto Catholicism last? It was so inward looking, it wasn't really healthy, not psychologically healthy. It wasn't going to last. It was going to crumble, and it was, they knew it. What's coming up, I think, is much more authentic, and it's because of the Vatican Council and the changes that were made. The changes, I mean, talk about, was there a rupture? Was there one church in 1960 and another church in 1966? No, it's one and the same. Change is of the nature of things. Tapantache, says Heraclitus, all things constantly in a state of flux, of change. And that change is positive in our sense because the Holy Spirit is not going to abandon us. The Holy Spirit did not abandon us, will not abandon us. Now, the First Vatican Council intended, the fathers of the First Vatican Council intended to treat the nature of the church in something like 15 chapters. They got around to 4 because the Piedmontese army seized the Vatican. The Italian Risorgimento, the Unification, the Pope was, well, his property seized, the bishops ran, and they couldn't get around doing more than what they did, which was the definition of the universal immediate jurisdiction of the papacy over all the churches and the infallibility of the Pope. They were going to get around to the bishops, but they couldn't get to it, and Vatican II did it. Now, has that been implemented? Not really. They wanted to change the line of authority from the bishop, the Pope, the Curia, the bishops. No, the Pope, the bishops, then the Curia. But the Curia is still in place. It's going to be. How this is going to change, I really don't know, but it will. I'm also an activist, by the way, and I cannot talk to an audience containing so many young people without making a pitch for the Catholic Worker. I brought along about 40 copies. Take one, see what you think. Take a visit down to the Lower East Side, where we have a men's house on 1st Street and the women's house on 3rd Street, Mary House for women and St. Joe's for men. There are men in the women's house and vice versa, but primarily Mary House is for women. Women are more vulnerable, as everyone would know. Homeless women are very often in psychological distress, if not mental illness. That's why they hit the streets, and if they're mentally well when they hit the streets, after a few weeks they're no longer. So it's a marvelous place. I love it. Now, I'm a peace activist, and I can't look at an audience containing young people, old people too, to recruit them for the peace movement on the basis of your Christian commitment, if you have one. An authentic Christian life today, Thomas Merton said in 1963, Catholic Worker, October, has to include a commitment to the abolition of war. The total abolition of war. Does that sound unrealistic? Well, I think it does, but I'll bet on it anyway. We have to. Does that mean that all violence is going to be erased from the face of the earth? But the phenomenon of war is something we simply can't afford to deal with any longer. Now, the Vatican Council's liturgy reform of liturgy came out of it, exposes people to the scriptures. That's very, very important. You hear in your own language a reading from the Old Testament, from Paul or one of the other letter writers, and from the Gospels. You hear it in every language, in your own language. And it's got to sink in. The liturgical reformers of the pre-Vatican II period and the people who implemented it were almost all of them deeply involved in the social question. Don Virgil Michael of Collegeville came from Maria Lach in Germany, wrote with Peter Morin the first English translation of Mounier's Personalism, the philosophy of people seen not as atomized individuals or subsumed in a collective, but as formed in, by, and for community. Individuals with rights and responsibilities, never to be used as means, never to be violated physically, psychologically, morally, and this is the cornerstone of our philosophy of peacemaking. Virgil Michael and Peter Morin wrote the translation of Personalism, which had an enormous effect. And the others, I can name them, but those names will probably not be familiar to you. But I knew many of them personally, and Bob Hovda and Gabe Hawk, a layman, one of my closest comrades. Been in Baghdad together. He just came back from 5 years in Syria, where he was successful in getting over 100 kids from Baghdad, from Iraq, whose educations were interrupted by our liberation of their country. Destruction is a better word. Getting them full scholarships to American universities so they can continue their education. Jerry Sloyan, oh boy, a whole bunch of them. The expectation of liturgical reformers was that as people heard the scriptures, they would see their practical application to their situation in life, and that there would be a burst of energy for social reform, social justice, and peace. And that, in fact, has happened to an extent, but we need an awful lot more, and that's what I've been writing. Now, the Constitution on the Church in the World today is a pastoral constitution. Some people say, well, you know, it's wonderful. It's such a different tone from the documents of previous councils where you had condemnations and anathema this and anathema that. Well, no anathemas, no condemnations? Not true. There were condemnations. There's condemnation of the war, of use of weapons of mass destruction, of infanticide, of slavery, all condemned explicitly. Abortion. But the document gave the peace movement a patent for its thrust after that. If the use of weapons of mass destruction is unequivocally condemned as immoral, unjustifiable, what then of the production and the maintenance of nuclear weapons? Does this not pose a problem? Morality ultimately resides in the intentional order. If I intend to rob that bank, I'm already guilty, even if I do not accomplish my goal. If we intend to use those weapons, we are already guilty. If we don't intend to use them and threaten to use them at the same time, then we're lying. And moral theologians have always had a difficulty with lying. Now, how are we going to deal with this? When the American bishops got together to write their challenge of peace, I was startled to be asked to participate in the consultation. There were only 3 peace people asked, and a couple of hundred people from the Pentagon and the State Department. The 3 of us met in Yale University at St. Thomas Church, University Church, to talk to the 5 bishops. One of them was Thomas Gumbleton of Detroit, who is a peace man. He's a very outspoken leader in the peace movement, president of Pax Christi, and he would never ever get his own diocese because so outspoken on the cause of peace. Great guy. And there was also a 27-year military veteran, John O'Connor, a retired vice admiral in the United States Navy. And it was he I talked to mostly, because he's the guy you had to convince. I had to keep toning down Tom Gumbleton. But talked to O'Connor, and it was simply marvelous. The result was, they came out with the challenge of peace, saying that the maintenance of the nuclear deterrent could be morally acceptable on a conditional and temporary basis. How long? They didn't say how long temporary was, but the idea was time would be used for negotiations for multilateral nuclear disarmament and then general disarmament. So that's the condition. How long is temporary? 10 years passed, and we had a hastening of the arms race, an intensification of the arms race. 20 years passed. Yes, more proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Finally, when was it? About 2 or 3 years ago, the Vatican representative to the United Nations, an Indian man, Cardinal Chillicothe, said time has run out. The Vatican, the Holy See, no longer sees any legal or moral justification for the maintenance of the deterrent. How many Catholics know that? How many, are you all familiar with what the Church has to say about artificial birth control and so on? You all know what the Church has to say about abortion? Are there any people who don't? Any people who don't? Okay, well, we're absolutely against abortion and we're not crazy about birth control. Most people are. But how many educated Catholic people know that we no longer have any justification for the maintenance of the deterrent, weapons of mass destruction, that the Church has dedicated itself, at least on paper, to peacemaking, the elimination of war. The Vatican Council document on war, the County Msgr section on war, refers to conscientious objection. Before this, conscientious objection to military service for Catholics was an unsettled question. There were 6 known Catholic conscientious objectors in World War I. In World War II, we had a few more, but not in any greater proportion than the Presbyterians did, about 0.0002%. 0.0002% in World War II. I applied for conscientious objector status in 1956 and was turned down by my local draft board, and I appealed to the appeal board for the state of Connecticut and went through an FBI investigation, and I had prepared my case very, very carefully with the assistance and under the direction of Father Ned Hogan, theology chairman at Fairfield University, who did not share my conclusion, but he assured me that my thinking was correct and orthodox, and that I had a legitimate claim on the basis of just war thinking as well as vocation, a perceived vocation to peacemaking, to nonviolence, which was proven to me by the very events of my life. Under spiritual direction, I came to this conclusion. And so the draft board sent my, I learned this many years later, sent my written appeal to Washington, to the bishop's headquarters, saying, is this legit? Is this guy a legitimate Catholic? Is this a claim that a Catholic can legitimately make? And the bishops looked at it and they said, we didn't know. We never studied this stuff when we were in seminary. So they sent it around to one theologian, another theologian, another. Finally, they found somebody in Chicago who said, yeah, he's right. There was one other case going through the channels at that time. I met him many years later. Howard Everingham was his name, dead man now. And the question was not settled. If you asked a typical pastor or bishop, can a Catholic be a conscientious objector? No. That's for Quakers, that's for Mennonites. That's for Anabaptists. That's not for us. Well, Vatican II gives high praise to those who refuse military service on the grounds of conscience. It goes on to say that laws should be made to protect their rights by civil government. And then, after that, they hold up the members of the military who served the cause of the freedom and security of their peoples honorably. They are to be praised also. That's great. But what does honorably mean? Honeste in Latin. Honestly? In truth? Okay. Well, we grant them good conscience. Of course, you must assume good conscience. In any situation, you assume good conscience, unless there's evidence to the contrary. But I believe from the depths of my heart and down to my toenails that the Holy Spirit is calling more and more men and women to dedicate themselves to the cause of nonviolence under the impulse of the Sermon on the Mount. And this is what the Holy Spirit is moving us toward in this day. I believe it's palpable. During the Vietnam War, the Catholics did very, very well in proportion to others in regard to resistance to the war in one form or another. There were as many men resisting the war in Vietnam as ever served in it. And there was a disproportionate number of Catholics. I was going around the country. I went one trip by Volkswagen Beetle Bud, 15,000 miles. Yeah. 97 stops. Fell apart 3 times. But I would go into a church, and after Mass, I'd go into the rectory to introduce myself, or the sacristy to introduce myself to the celebrant, and there he'd be counseling a conscientious objector. All over the country it was like that. It was absolutely marvelous. So the Spirit is moving, things are happening, things are changing, they are in continuity with our past. No rupture. I hate this stuff about a rupture between the past. It's baloney. As Peter Moore used to say, baloney is still baloney no matter how you slice it. But the new liturgy, the social awareness, the awakening of the laity, the growth of the new lay movements, our Catholic worker movement predates all of this. We're going to be 80 years old in May, 1 year older than I am. And we have not just the Legion of Mary anymore, we have Pax Christi, we have the Neo-Catechumenate, we have Lamp Ministries, we have so many, I can't name them off the top of my head, but there are about 18 groups and the Council of Ecclesial Movements in the Archdiocese of New York. At least. Well, I don't know where to go from here. It's a thrill to see you all in such a representative-looking group with all ages and students and workers, and we're not all Irish and Italian either. We're thinking of, this is the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington that was organized by my beloved friend, Byron Russell. He, Rayville and Randolph. I was deeply involved in that too. Thank you very much. I hope we'll have some questions and answers. Maybe a challenge or two. I'm thick-skinned. You can come after me.
There will be questions. We certainly have time for that. And I think anything is on the floor related to what today. So anybody want to start off? Vatican Council, your position on it, the whole notion of rupture, continuity. Go ahead.
I'd like to ask, did your parents have any influence on your pacifism?
I was born an atheist, but I was baptized as about a week old. I didn't have any faith at all when I was born. But my mother was an observant Catholic. My father went to Mass, I think, when I got my first communion. My sister got her first communion, and when we were both confirmed, and, at the time, you come to church 3 times in your life, and twice they have to carry you in. He was that type.
Any other questions?
No, I went.
Go ahead.
The Jesuits at Fairfield University really turned me on. I lived in a very impoverished state. I mean, we didn't have heat, not one. I started working at the age of 20. I was working 70 hours, 60 hours a week.
Well, this WASP has a question.
The Jesuits, they gave us an education, they opened my mind. I just can't express adequately my appreciation and love for those guys.
The Franciscans do a good job here too. It's equal time. So we have a question here.
Oh, well, I saw something on television just a couple of weeks ago about a group of women Catholics who wanted to be priests. And they started their own church. And I'm not sure, somebody let them use, it may have been a Protestant group that let them use their church. And apparently they were excommunicated. And somebody said, well, you could become Episcopalians. And they said, oh no, we're Catholic. And they continued to go on and hold these services. I guess all women attended. But, you know, you just wonder if this is something that could happen before, I don't know, who knows how long, but...
Well, I'll tell you, on that one, I think very high on the agenda in Rome is reconciliation with the Orthodox Church, healing the division. For 1,000 years, there was one Catholic Church.
Right.
And we want it to be that way again. And ordination of women to the diaconate is something that the Catholic and Orthodox community can discuss together, and are, as a matter of fact, discussing about it together. We will not ordain women to the priesthood if Constantinople and Moscow say no. It's just ain't going to happen. Because that would, they would say, they would just turn their backs on us. They're very difficult to work with, by the way. Our current era of the church would be ecumenically minded and interfaithful. There were Jews at the Second Vatican, and Heschel, what a guy. But the Orthodox are extremely difficult to work with. They don't have a sufficient power and authority at the top to make them all move together. So change is very, very difficult in the Orthodox Church. Very. And if we go off and ordain women, they're going to just turn their backs on us. So we're going to have to wait a while on that. We can, I believe, attain permission for married men to be ordained to the priesthood. That should be pretty different. Well, yes, because the Italians and Lutherans will come over. But not if you can't be a Catholic and then decide you're going to be an Episcopalian and then get married and then come back to the Catholic Church. There could be an indult of mercy for guys who left the priesthood and got married. There could be an indult of mercy. That's conceivable. But I think it's perfectly obviously clear we cannot go on the way we are with the priesthood. The people have a right and justice in the sacraments, and being denied this right by the imposition of celibacy. And I'll tell you this, I don't. Some of these guys that are ordaining, you really wonder about them. Last Sunday I had a sermon in which the priest said that we are at war, we're in a state of war with Islam. And then he defended the Crusades. I haven't heard anything like that for over 50 years.